Good afternoon, everybody. I know that lunch ran a little bit over, but we are trying to keep to our schedule, so we're going to go ahead and get started for the 1:30 session. The next three presenters in this room will be talking about VRS, which is a very important part of our work and a growing part of our field. So we're very excited to have the three of them present today. I am your moderator. I'm Lori Schaffer. And I will be here from 1:30 to 3. Our first presenter is Erica Alley. And she will be presenting, as I said, on video relay service. Erica. Hello, everyone. Hope you enjoyed lunch. You're ready to learn more. I know it's the second day, so you might start to feel that you're getting a little bit saturated, but hopefully you also feel that it's worth it to be here. So I'm going to be talking about video relay service, and that is different from video remote interpreting. VRI is something that is mandated by the FCC, but there are individual VRS provider companies who formulate their own rules, and sometimes interpreters working in VRS settings don't know if the rules have come from the FCC or from the provider they're working with, and they're not sure how they can then make judgments and decisions. I do want to emphasize that the work that I have done is only in the United States, although many other countries have started to have VRS. It's present in Germany, Denmark, Sweden, France. There are countries where VRS and VRI are used and have been used. But the research that I did was only in a U.S. context, and the people that I interviewed were specifically in the U.S. context. So I want to be clear that I'm only speaking to the U.S. context. Every day, deaf people across the country are making phone calls. And they can be simple phone calls from ordering pizza, making doctor's appointments, or they can be calling into work. There are a lot of people who are teleworking or have conference calls, and that communication is a mediated interaction. We as interpreters know what it is that we're supposed to be doing, but unfortunately, the rules around VRS prohibit researchers from getting naturalistic data. So I'm going to tell you about my study today, and there are other studies that I want to share with you as well. As I said, the rules are established by the FCC, originally from the ADA, and then they're interpreted by the FCC. One of the rules is that VRS services must be available for the deaf community 24/7. Another rule is that you cannot refuse calls, that interpreters must accept all calls. You know, if they want to interpret one call or don't want to interpret another call, they don't have that kind of leniency. And as I said, you can't film, and the other presenters will discuss that as well, you can't film naturalistic data. So we have limited information, and the kind of information we're getting is from other sources. David Quinto Pozos, for example, today, and Rafael Trevino, who is, oh, there he is, we're talking about their research doing mock VRS calls. So they had a video, they had interpreters interpreting the phone call and leaving a message, or listening to a message and leaving a message in sign language. So they used that script. That would be one way to get at VRS data. Jeremy Brunson also talked about his own personal experiences and ethnographic data. Katie Bauer sent out a survey and collected data that way. And you'll hear more about that in a moment. And this all is because we cannot get naturalistic data in VRS call centers, as we are prohibited from filming in there. So this is a pilot study, and I did interviews. I only have 4 participants thus far, including somebody from the Video Interpreter Member section of RID. That's member section from Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, a manager from a call center, and then and then 2 interpreters who work in VRS settings. I talked to them about, for example, you're all familiar with the 10-minute rule. Do you know where that came from? So I asked them those sorts of questions, and I had very interesting results. Basically, they have no idea. They know that there are certain rules that are promulgated. My favorite is the final one. Did other people know the answer? Did other people get that right? People not exactly sure where those rules coming from. And we know as interpreters that there are problems within the VRS settings. And sometimes the managers will say, well, our hands are tied. The FCC has, put forward a certain rule. We have to follow it. And then you go back to the FCC, and in fact, the FCC, it doesn't have a rule that applies to whatever scenario, that is on the table. And interpreters are left in the middle, not really sure where to point the finger, whether it's at the company that they're working for or the FCC. So interpreters have a sense that something is wrong, but we don't exactly know how to fix it. Interpreters are not sure how much power and control they have in this situation. They're in a call center facilitating calls all day long, and feel quite powerless in that situation. So what I was interested in was not only if we don't know who makes the rules, but are interpreters following the rules? And I wondered if they weren't sure who had promulgated the rule in the first place, might they be less likely or more likely to follow that rule? I'm expecting to interview 30 participants. I've actually done 7 interviews so far. But the reason I say approximately 30 is because I'm using grounded theory methodology. And grounded theory basically says you don't know if you've interviewed enough people until you start getting results. So you interview as many subjects as you need to, and when the results start emerging, then you know that you're done. When you've achieved saturation. And what that means is if you're hearing the same answers again and again, there's no new information from the interviews, you're actually done. You've interviewed enough people. So I'm estimating that it will be 30 participants, but I don't actually know. Some of the interviews are guided discussion, because I have very pointed questions based on some of my previous work. So there's no right or wrong answers. I'm asking open-ended questions. For example, can you tell me about your most recent VRS shift? And then they'll start to talk about that, and some kinds of content will emerge that I will follow up, follow them as they're going through the conversation. I don't want them to feel that they're being judged by the answers, so I'd rather have conversations that are a little bit more open-ended. And I'm also engaging in comparative analysis. So all of the conversations, interviews are being recorded and transcribed. So it takes a very, very long time to transcribe these interviews. But I transcribe it, I print it out, and then I compare one to the next to see if there are themes that emerge, to see if there are certain feelings that are common elements among the different interpreters. And then I'll interview them again, and I'm constantly comparing all of the participant information. And I'm doing it as I go, because if the 30th person came up with something that I should have asked the second person or the third person, I will have missed the opportunity. So I'm constantly having that feedback loop. I noticed a pattern in the interviews I've conducted thus far, that interpreters are making decisions based on their sense that if it will lead to a successful interpretation. So if I would ask, why did you do X, Y, or Z? The answer was, well, because it worked. It made the conversation seamless. It resulted in an effective conversation. So an example is the phone tree. Those of you who are here in the room are very familiar with the phone tree, where you press 1 if you need to speak to somebody from tech support, or press 2 for billing, whatever it might be. So those kind of menu options. Deaf people were not as familiar with phone trees. Now, of course, they're becoming more familiar, but what interpreters found themselves doing, some interpreters would go ahead and interpret that whole menu. And some interpreters would just ask the deaf person, do you want to speak to a live person? Because we know as hearing individuals that if you press 0, you're likely to be routed to a live customer representative. Deaf people don't have that fund of knowledge. They just haven't had that experience. And so some interpreters would let the deaf people know, we can press 0 to get to a live person. So they would share information about the world, and they would educate the deaf community because they wanted them to have a successful call. Several of the participants said that they would ask for clarification, even though they're technically not supposed to. We're supposed to function like a dial tone, or just the conduit model again, just passing that information from one language to another. But if you have to ask for clarification to have a successful call, you will ask for clarification, or they would at any rate. And my personal perspective as well is that interpreters have also been willing to ask for physical changes. For example, if they can't see the caller because of the lighting set up, if there's a window right behind the caller's head, they'll be completely in shadow. And so the interpreters will have the sense of agency enough to ask for physical changes to be made to, again, result in a successful interpretation. This is just an example of one of the calls. So it was a phone tree situation. Somebody was getting to tech support. They were told to reboot their system. The deaf person got up and walked out of the room. And so this is how they handled that issue of looking at an empty screen. So they weren't actually interpreting that call, because the hearing person on the other end, if you sit in silence because the deaf person is not in the room, the hearing person is very likely to hang up. As you know, hearing people have no tolerance for silence. So this interpreter chose to do this again because the goal was to have a successful interpretation. Another situation is with the abusive or angry caller, where a caller is angry that the interpreter doesn't understand them, and they might have a negative attitude. So I wondered how interpreters would handle that. It's a very different feeling than when somebody seems very cooperative. The interpreters in my study would make different decisions, from deaf person to deaf person, depending on if they were nice to them or not. So, for example, one of the participants said, they couldn't catch a finger spelling, and they asked for a clarification. And if the deaf person was unwilling to clarify, then that interpreter would not interpret into English, but would interpret into, what would be heard as broken English. Another option, obviously, would be to transfer the call. If somebody feels, I really don't have to put up with being abused at work, but you can't transfer the call if it's less than 10 minutes, because that is an FCC rule that calls, you have to remain in call for 10 minutes. And there were interpreters who felt that they would not follow that rule because they do not believe that they deserve abuse, and they would not tolerate it. And another option would be to report the caller. Just process the call and then type up a report afterwards. That was another action that interpreters can and do take. So this is a quote from one of my participants who just felt that they